Newsologist. One world, many views. Yes, some of them. ECB raised their basic bank rate by 0.75%, 75 basis points. LEGARDE, she's the boss of the ECB, and she had a little bit of a press conference. Basically, she reiterated a number of times what they're about. As ever with the question and answer dog and pony shows, the reporters are on their best behaviour, and basically they're asking realistically mundane questions which they half know the answer for because they don't want to be obnoxious and ask how did we get into this state. At the present time, she's covered because everything is getting piled on to Russia and the energy costs. And no mention, and I wouldn't have expected any mention, but a lot of the energy cost increases are self-induced. It's not that Russia doesn't want to sell you the gas, it's that you don't want to buy it. This has pushed up inflation. After a year or more of prevarication in watching inflation going up and watching the sloth-like rate of the US Fed to get its gear into action, the ECB has been even slothier. It's the slothiest. The Fed's been raising pop, increasing every 6 weeks or so. The Bank of England's been increasing. When you get crises, what tends to happen is that even when the American economy is getting battered, it tends to make the dollar viz the other world currencies stronger. The dollar gets stronger. The rest of the world gets weaker. The big thing about that is that commodity prices primarily denominated in USD. So as the euro and the pound slides against the increase in dollar, the Fed's been raising their interest rates. It's been sucking money into the US. The UK and the EU have lagged behind. The exchange rate has went against the EU. It's touched below parity with the dollar. Used to be to $1. Now for $1 you can get a euro in a bit. So that's helping to push the EU land inflation rates high. She basically just ran round and round saying the same thing but in different ways to people. They have an inflation target, i.e. an inflation tax, where they can erode, get shot of the debt by this 2% a year inflation. I'm not familiar at the present time with what she means by medium term. Is that 2 to 3 years, 1 to 2 years, whatever? She's obviously got to live within the monetary policy of the EU, and the difficulty with the EU is it's a grouping of various countries with varying economies, but each one of these originates its own debt denominated in euros. So in Germany they originate debt, and that's a German bond. In Italy they originate a debt and it's in euros, but it's an Italian bond. The difficulty which they've got, and it's existed since day one, is that there's been a bond spread of the rates, the yields on the bonds. Traditionally, the German bond has yielded less than an Italian bond. The reason for that is obviously the risk of default. The risk of default, I would say, realistically is zero, because the EU, the ECB, the Eurozone have got nothing realistically to do with finance. It's to do with politics, and the politicians will pay any price, walk any distance, climb any mountain to ensure that the euro and Euroland doesn't break up. There will not be a Ital exit. It'll not be allowed to happen. It'll never happen. Even if the Italians decide that they want to Ital exit, the roadblocks, the barricades, the blockages which will be put in their way will be so immense, it will never happen. It will never come to pass. So LEGARDE goes on, 2% medium term, we'll base it on new data. It's, it's a bit of monetary policy, we'll cross bridges, when we get there. It's a bit of technical, it's a bit of artistic, blah, 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 blah. She agreed the impact on inflation was caused to a large extent by the energy costs. No mention, because it's a political thing, there's no mention of the sanctions. If there hadn't been any sanctions, there wouldn't have been any reduction in the energy. Now you can say, oh, you can't do that because of the events which are going on in Ukraine. The events which are going on in Ukraine are terrible. There's absolutely nobody going to disagree with that. There seems to be reluctance on the part of politicians in the West to accept their own responsibility of the actions that have caused these higher prices. You could say, well, that's terrible. We must do the sanctions. We must do the sanctions. This is a price worth paying. A lot of the people saying this is a price worth paying aren't having to pay the price. None of these politicians, in essence, are going to feel any impingement on that standard of living. And that's politicians in the UK, the US, or EU land. None of them. The people that feel these things will be the people at the bottom, people on low rates of pay, pensioners, people on fixed incomes. Now, most of the countries, and in the UK, there's going to be some sort of cap, $2,500. It's going to be maybe reductions in VAT and stuff like that. The difficulty which Europe has is this: to protect Italy and other countries from having this transmission protection, which basically means that the spreads on the Italian bonds get totally out of whack with the bonds on the other countries, would be to assist Italy in buying Italian debt in preference to other countries' debt. In essence, the ECB will fund the Italian deficit. You're asking people in all of Europe to pay into the ECB so that the ECB can then buy Italian BTPs, Italian bonds, their version of gilts, their version of treasuries. The TPI was approved, and they've got some blah, blah, blah criteria for how they're going to use it. I have no doubts that pushy comes to shovey, if that happens, these criteria will be amended, and there'll be a coach, a horse, and a flock of sheep driven through the gap. None of these things which the EU ever says when it makes these lines and red lines and whatever coloured lines that it wants to make about criteria for this and eligibility for that, none of them apply. These are just all blah, blah, blah. Look great on paper. When you look at it, wow, what a great plan for a house that is. When you actually get out on the site and you take a look at what's being built, it doesn't seem to match up with what's on the plans. And that's exactly the same with this. This TPI is Band-Aid. It's like, ooh, we've got this. Look, you've got to do this and you've got to be that. And, you can't have this and you can't have an excessive debt and blah, blah, blah and blah, blah, blah. And we've got all of these criteria that you must meet, 3 or 4 criteria that you must meet before you can get your hands on this TPI money. And none of that will be enforced, in my opinion, on past events that's happened. The EU is a political project. Any price will be paid to maintain it. Any criteria will be amended. Any eligibility will be put into one side to allow the political thing to go on. This TPI is in essence designed to buy outstanding debt bonds from the country in the EU land that's having a hard time, and it's sort of like medium-term debt with 1 to 10 years term left on the bond. But there's a provision in there that they could also go to buy in corporate corporate debt. Why not? And this is to prevent the fragmentation, trying to prevent the financially weaker countries from going under. And they had some penny crisis where they were buying stuff, but this TPI, there's no maximum. Where I've got no idea what the maximum is, and they've got this excessive deficit procedure, fiscal sustainability, and wow. The question you've got to ask yourself is, if they've got all of these procedures and criterias and stuff like that, how come they've ended up in the position that they have. How come did Greece happen 10 years ago? How come these things? And procedures, the Maastrichts and the 3% and the 60% and all of this, they were all well known about. It's because the EU people looked the other way when they wanted Greece to join. And that's exactly what will happen with this TPI, in my mind. So Lagarde saying 2%, 2%, 2%, medium term, medium term, medium term. We're really sorry, it's went a bit higher, like 10 plus. Is it 12, 14, 16, blah, who knows? The difference is in the US is that they've got high inflation, but they've got a relatively, comparatively low unemployment. In EU land, they've got high inflation and they've got high youth unemployment and they've got higher unemployment. If you start clicking up, which they've done, they've moved from a negative rate to a zero rate, and now they're moving to a positive rate, 75 BP, 0.75%. The tendency is to make money more expensive. The tendency is to cut demand. The tendency is that jobs will be lost. People will have less money because you're requiring them to pay more money for the same goods. If you've got a mortgage, you will have to pay more. That's less money that you can spend in a restaurant, less money that you can spend online buying stuff, less money that you can spend on whatever it was that you wanted to spend it on. In essence, that tends to mean less people are needed, less jobs. So you can see why the EU landers were reluctant to increase the rates. You increase the rates, you put unemployment even higher. There was a point raised about deflation, and Lagarde was adamant that she didn't want deflation. She's quite happy to have a 2% tax inflation on you so that they can erode away the debt that the ECB is raising. That's fine, but when the erosion goes to 10 and 12%, people start getting a bit lumpy about it. People start getting a bit annoyed. People start asking for hefty wage increases to compensate for them. This is all standard playbook stuff. It's not like it's an unknown method to tackle inflation, putting interest rates up. She acknowledged that inflation hits lower paid people more, which is, come on, You don't have to be a quant, you don't have to be a PhD, you don't have to have masters on an ordinary degree to work that one out. Lagarde will not suffer by this in any way. Similarly, none of the politicians were insulated from the effects of inflation to a huge degree. A lot of them are funded expenses, travel. The EU parliamentarians get very generous allowances. So none of the people which have been in charge of this will suffer any real hardship by it. Basically, the US is grinding down the UK and the Eurolanders and basically everybody else in the world at the moment because the currencies are devaluing against the dollar. Commodities denominated in dollars means everybody else has got a de facto price rise on their hands. They've got a de facto inflation on their hands. Lagarde went on basically jibber-jabbering, saying it can't just be purely mathematical, there's got to be some collective judgment. Basically what she's saying is, doesn't make any difference what the numbers say. I have to have a bit chat with the EU Commission in VD Lyon and the rest of the honchos across there, and they will tell me what I can and cannot do. Same old. It's going to be meeting by meeting, as though that is something radical, as though that's something that they never did. The reason that it didn't look that way is because things weren't changing. When you've got the same rate for 10 years, there's not going to be very much happening at any of the meetings. Yes, we all agree that. Hands up. Yep, that's it. Right, let's get the smoked salmon and them fish eggs and a bit of filet mignon and let's have a good scran. She's alluding to it being data-driven, but there's so much of it influenced by the Commission in the EU land. The difficulty that the EU now has is that it's called catch-up. The other kids, the ECB, they've waddled off, and the Bank of England's waddled off a couple of months in front of them. So the ECB is now getting its Nike's on, or it's Adidas on, or Saucony's or Mizuno, your running shoe of choice, and they're getting togged up ready for the little race. The other banks, the other central banks, have got a bit of a head start. The difficulty that the ECB has, they can't raise the rates as fast as what they would need to catch up. If they raise the rates too quickly, i.e., I will just raise it to 4%. If they do something like that, it'll just be like a stall on an engine. You'll just choke the demand off so quickly. It's a matter of gradually applying the brake or the accelerator, whichever way you want to look at it. Gradually applying it. In this case, brake analogy is probably the best. Gradually applying it to slow the economy and slow the inflation and take jobs out. If you go too big, too early, 4%, then it'll just be like jamming the brakes on. You'll get a skid on the economy. Realistically, the ECB should have been doing this since the turn of the year. Same as the Bank of England, same as the Fed. They're reluctant to do it. They held on to the, it's transitory. No, it's going to go away and stuff like that. Inflation was coming. It's just that the events in the East have hastened it and they've accelerated. These problems would have still been there, perhaps not to the same degree, but these problems of inflation were latent in the economy. They were latent because of the massive amounts of new money which had been created, pumped into the economies of the Western countries, US, UK, Euroland, to combat the lurgy, which happened in 2020. Pumping money into the economy takes time for it to filter through. It was filtering through, and then on top you've had the flake on top of the ice cream sundae was the events in the East. The difficulty is that none of the bankers, none of the politicians want to do anything other than just say it's the events in the East which are causing all this. It's a convenient blanket scapegoat to put over the real cause of a lot of the inflation, which is the money printing, which has gone on for years and years, especially during the lurgy time. That's all forgotten now. The lurgy's old hat. Nobody wants to hear about the lurgy. Nobody wants to hear about the money that was printed during the lurgy. Nobody wants to hear about any of that. It's now all focused on Mr. P and the Ruskies and what's happening. Yeah, they are the baddies, and I'm not suggesting that they're not. The difficulty is that the politicians and the bankers, central bankers, don't want to and won't admit their part in creating the inflation in the first place. From their point of view, it's so convenient that this has happened for them. Yeah, it's Mr. P. That's the reason. Yep. Hadn't it been for Mr. P, there wouldn't have been any problem. Would have just been transitory, blah, blah, blah. Would it? I don't think so. What happens at the next meeting? Impossible to tell. You don't know if the gas supplies are going to be on or off from Mr. P and the R's. That's the Ruskies. You've got no idea if that'll happen. You don't know how much the Fed in the US, when they have the next meeting, how much they put up. What happens if the Yankees put it up by 1%, 100 BP? What happens then? ECB's clawed back 75, 0.75% against the Yankees and the UK. What happens if the Fed and the Bank of England open that gap up by putting a bit of a sprint on and going a full 100 BP? Full 1%. Money can flow around the world. Money can flow from country to country. But Lagarde, she wants to do the normalisation. So basically, by admission, what she's stating is that the situation that they're in at the moment is abnormal and has been, and she wants to bring it back to normalisation, which means getting inflation down to a 2% target. In the medium term, of course. How long will it take? I would say realistically 2 years before you would get like a consistent 2%, over a couple of months. What isn't discussed is what's happened to all of the people that's left high and dry. Because the inflation goes up, most of the prices don't come down after the inflation. Your price of a loaf goes up from £1 to £1.50 or from £1.50 to £2, depends which kind of loaf you're buying. But a lot of these prices never seem to come down. People will bear the higher burden of prices unless they get wage rises. There's going to be a lot of wage rise claims in the UK. You've got the barristers, you've got the train drivers, underground people, the doctors. Just basically just about everybody in the country is wanting a wage rise. The problem with the inflation is that most people never talk about it, but now it's front and centre. The Lecky and the events in the East have brought inflation full and centre, full stage. People go, well, if inflation's 10%, I need a 10% rise. Or inflation's 12%, I need a 12%. Now, if inflation's 12%, I need a 14% rise, because I need to make up for the time I've lost and inflation, and I need to give myself a little bit of a buffer for it continuing to grow. In fact, I need 16 or 18%. How do you like them requests coming in? If you're any sort of industry, people are losing out. We're now into a stage of inflation that you're getting inflation on inflation. It's like interest on interest. People can see their standards of living going down. What do they do about it? If you're in a strong union, you're going to ask for money. By getting the wage increase, that will fuel more inflation. If you're working in the bakery and you're getting a 10%, 12% rise, that rise can only be realistically passed on by charging some extra pennies for the bread, so that becomes inflationary. Some people say that people talking about inflation and knowing about inflation causes inflation. Perhaps there's an element of that, but I think realistically it's if people have inflation brought to them front and centre so that they can see it, then they're more likely to request an inflation or an inflation plus wage rise. If everybody that's working for the government gets a wage rise aligned with inflation as it stands at the moment, just the CPI, which is 10%, then that's going to put the amount of money that the government has to spend on wages up by at least 10%. The government has no money, therefore the government would either have to increase the pie, make the pie bigger, tax pie bigger, come up with some new taxes, or make the economy bigger, keep the same percentage of tax, or we'd have to get rid of people. We'd have to do something, or we'd have to borrow more money. That's the one, yeah, let's borrow more money. That's always worked in the past. We can't just keep borrowing it and borrowing it and borrowing it. All of these come back to a basic tenet, really, that governments can't handle the economies without resorting to debt. They promise too much, and if you were a politician, you would promise everybody everything. Borrow the money, you get voted in the next time. Come along with austerity, you get voted out. It's obvious what's going to happen. The difficulty is that it has to be legislative. It has to be something like a law which says that the government has to have a balanced budget. Taxes must equal outgoings. All that does is you just get creative over everything. The real problem never gets addressed. The real problem is debt, the volume of debt compared with the size of the economy. Anyway, that was LEGARDE, 2% medium term. We're going to do what it takes. There you go. Time to put the kettle on.